January 1943, Solomon Islands. The morning sun rose over the Pacific, cutting through drifting layers of mist and smoke. From above, the deep blue ocean looked deceptively calm, a mirror to a world at war. Japanese pilots of the Imperial Navy scanned the horizon from the cockpits of their Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the fighters that had ruled these skies since Pearl Harbor. They expected another easy hunt. But from the coral airstrip below, something new emerged. Something alien. A dark bent-wing silhouette roared upward with a scream so deep it vibrated the canopy glass. Its nose seemed too long, its frame too heavy. Yet it climbed, impossibly, faster than any Zero. As the Japanese leader banked toward it, the newcomer rolled inverted, dove, and vanished into the clouds. Seconds later, tracers tore through the formation from above. The era of Japanese air supremacy was ending. Not with an explosion, but with the arrival of the F4U Corsair, the fastest naval fighter the world had ever seen. Its legend began that day, in skies once owned by the rising sun. In early 1943, the Pacific was still an empire of burning horizons. The Japanese Zero, with its long wings and whispering engine, had been a symbol of terror for more than a year. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, Allied pilots described the same helpless feeling, being outturned, outclimbed, and outflown by a machine that seemed to defy gravity itself. When the Zero first appeared in 1940, it shattered every assumption about what a naval fighter could do. It could fly more than 1,100 kilometers without refueling, climb to altitude faster than most interceptors, and turn inside almost anything that flew. Against that, early American aircraft, like the F-2A Buffalo or the F-4F Wildcat, were outdated, underpowered, and outmatched. Pilots learned to respect the Zero, even as they died fighting it. By 1942, the United States Navy faced an urgent truth. It could not win the Pacific with courage alone. It needed something faster, stronger, and more survivable. A machine that could climb above the Zero and dictate the fight. That answer began taking shape far from the battlefield, in a quiet Connecticut factory owned by Vought Sikorsky Aircraft. The project, labeled simply XF4U-1, aimed to create the fastest carrier-based fighter ever built. The lead designer, Rex Beisel, pushed his team toward limits most thought impossible. To achieve their dream, they chose an engine that seemed absurd for a single-seat aircraft. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced over 2,000 horsepower. It was massive, loud, and temperamental, but it promised one thing: power unmatched in the sky. To harness that power, engineers shaped the aircraft around it, literally. The Corsair's signature inverted gull wings weren't artistic. They were engineering necessity. They allowed shorter landing gear for carrier decks while keeping the huge propeller clear of the ground. The result was a fighter that looked strange, but sliced through the air like nothing before. In test flights during 1940 and 1941, the Corsair stunned even its creators. It broke 400 miles per hour, making it the first American fighter to do so. But speed came at a cost. Pilots reported violent torque rolls, narrow landing visibility, and bouncing takeoffs that broke gear struts. The Navy was skeptical. As America reeled from Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Corsair project still felt like a gamble. The aircraft was fast but unpredictable. Too wild, perhaps, for the carrier deck. Engineers refined the design endlessly, adjusting flaps, visibility, and stall behavior, while the war outside demanded results faster than engineering could deliver. Meanwhile, the Zero dominated. Its lightweight frame and elite pilots, trained in dogfighting since the Sino-Japanese War, ruled from Burma to Midway. At Guadalcanal, Marines fought under skies owned by Japan. American planes climbed too slowly, turned too wide, and burned too easily. But something was changing. The U.S. Navy's intelligence analysts and pilots who survived combat began to learn the Zero's weaknesses. It had no armor behind the pilot's seat. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, and above 20,000 feet its performance dropped sharply. The Corsair, on the other hand, thrived in that altitude. Its engine, though heavy, delivered power where the Zero suffocated. The equation was shifting, and both sides could feel it. By late 1942, Vaught's engineers had fixed the worst of the Corsair's problems. Production began ramping up. The Navy, still cautious, decided to send the first batches not to carrier decks, but to Marine air groups operating from land bases. The Marines accepted. They had no choice. They needed fighters, any fighters, for the island campaigns ahead. And so, in dusty airfields carved into coral rock and surrounded by jungle, the Corsair would first prove itself, not as the Navy's weapon, but as the Marines' unlikely savior. The stage was set. In early 1943, as the Solomon Islands burned and the Zero still owned the sky, a new kind of sound began to echo from the runways. Deeper, heavier, defiant. It was the sound of a machine built not for elegance, but for endurance. A machine that would soon change everything about aerial combat in the Pacific. When the first Corsairs arrived in the Pacific, they didn't go to the polished decks of fleet carriers. They went to crude, muddy airstrips, carved into jungle by bulldozers and sweat. These were the bases of the U.S. Marine Corps air groups, the first to fly the new fighter in combat. The men who received them were half skeptical, half hopeful. The Corsair's shape looked strange. Its nose blocked forward view during landing. It was a brute to handle on approach, bouncing on its long legs before settling down. But once in the air, it was alive, fast, steady, almost untouchable in a dive. The Marines of VMF 124 were the first to take it into battle, operating from Guadalcanal in February 1943. Their mission was simple: protect supply routes, challenge Japanese air patrols, and begin to erode the enemy's confidence. At first, the Corsair's appearance startled friend and foe alike. Its bent gull wings caught light differently, shimmering between blue and silver as it banked. When the Japanese spotted it for the first time, they mistook it for a new type of wildcat, until it accelerated past them. Behind that speed was the same R-2800 double wasp engine that powered America's P-47 Thunderbolt. It gave the Corsair a raw, thunderous strength that pilots could feel in their bones. In level flight, it outpaced the Zero by nearly 70 miles per hour. In a dive, it was untouchable. And unlike the fragile Japanese design, the Corsair was wrapped in armor. Its cockpit, oil cooler, and fuel tanks protected by thick plating. Yet early missions were far from easy. The aircraft's quirks caused accidents. Carrier trials ended in smashed landing gear and broken wings. Many commanders questioned if the design would ever be tamed enough for naval use. But for the Marines, the Corsair was all they had, and they learned to master it. Gradually, tactics began to evolve. American pilots realized that turning with a Zero was suicide. Instead, They climbed high, attacked in steep dives, and never lingered in a turning fight. The Corsairs' power allowed them to dictate when to engage and when to vanish. They called it boom and zoom. On the Japanese side, the war in the air was changing faster than Tokyo could replenish pilots. The Zero was still graceful, but its pilots were no longer the elite veterans of 1941. Many had died over Midway and Guadalcanal. Their replacements flew bravely, but lacked the experience that once defined the Imperial Navy Air Service. Meanwhile, American training programs, backed by enormous industrial output, were producing new pilots and aircraft by the thousands. It wasn't just a war of skill anymore. It was a war of attrition, and Japan was beginning to lose that war. By the middle of 1943, Corsairs were spreading across the South Pacific, from the Russell Islands to Bougainville. They escorted bombers, attacked shipping, and began the slow reversal of Japanese air dominance. Each encounter added to a growing reputation. The Japanese started calling it whistling death, for the eerie sound of air passing through its oil-cooling vents during dives. Still, few in Japan fully understood what they were facing. Reports filtered back describing a fast, dark blue fighter that could outclimb a Zero, dive steeper, and take hits that would shred any Japanese plane. Some commanders dismissed it as exaggeration. Others began to worry the Americans had leaped ahead technologically. The truth was even more unsettling. America's engineers had created not just a better fighter, but an entire new category of air weapon. One that could combine speed, strength, and range in a single machine. And soon, that machine would meet the Zero head-on, high above the jungle and the sea, where every advantage or flaw meant life or death. When the F4U Corsair first entered combat, it didn't just introduce a new fighter. It brought a new philosophy of air warfare. To understand its transformation of the Pacific skies, one must see it through several lenses: technology, tactics, and psychology. The technological angle. Muscle versus grace. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was born from an age of minimalist perfection. Every bolt and rivet was chosen to make it lighter, faster, more agile. It was an extension of a samurai's sword. Elegant, but fragile. Its designers sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight, believing the best defense was to never be hit. The Corsair represented the opposite philosophy. It was industrial power incarnate. Thick armor plating, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks, and an engine nearly twice the weight of a Zero's. It was not a duelist's weapon. It was a hammer. When Japanese pilots first faced it, they were stunned not by its speed alone, but by its refusal to die. Corsairs came home riddled with bullet holes that would have turned a Zero into a fireball. The double Wasp engine, built in American factories, by the tens of thousands, could absorb punishment and still deliver power. In pure climb performance, the Corsair shattered expectations. At full throttle, it could reach 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes, faster than even Japan's best interceptors. What made it terrifying wasn't just that it could reach the Zero. It could stay above it, dictate the fight, and escape whenever it wished. The war in the air had become a contest of industrial endurance versus artisanal mastery, and the industrial world was beginning to win. The tactical angle. The birth of boom and zoom. At first, American pilots tried to outturn the Zero and paid for it with their lives. The Corsair's power meant nothing if a pilot allowed himself to get caught in a spiraling duel. The Zero could pivot inside its arc and strike before the Corsair could recover. But men like John T. Blackburn and Gregory Pappy Boyington realized that dogfighting in the old sense no longer applied. The Corsair wasn't a knife fighter, it was a diving falcon. Tactics evolved almost overnight. Corsair squadrons learned to climb above enemy patrols, then dive like thunderbolts. The approach was steep, violent, and decisive. They'd unleash short bursts of 6.E, 50-caliber Browning machine guns, then pull away before the Zero could respond. Hit hard, get out, and live to strike again became the unspoken rule. The Japanese tried to adapt, but the Corsair's dive speed was unmatched. Even when a Zero attempted to follow, its thin wings began to flutter, its frame shuddering at speeds the Corsair considered normal. The psychological advantage shifted. Japanese pilots began to fear the high sun, knowing that somewhere above, a blue-winged predator might be waiting. The psychological angle, confidence and shock. By 1943, Japanese airmen had been told for years that they were the best in the world. Their Zero was faster, lighter, and deadlier, and for a time it was true. They had faced sluggish American aircraft and won again and again. But the first encounters with the Corsair disrupted that certainty. Reports from Japanese combat diaries described confusion. It climbed with us, but heavier. It should not have been possible. Another pilot wrote after a mission near Rabaul, "The new blue plane could dive and escape every time. Our guns hit, but it did not fall." This disbelief was as damaging as any bullet. The psychological dominance Japan had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor began to erode. The Corsair didn't just beat the Zero, it dismantled the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air. On the American side, the emotional shift was equally profound. For the first time, pilots felt they had a machine worthy of their courage. Confidence returned. Where once they had flown defensively, now they hunted. The Corsair became a symbol of turning tides, of industrial vengeance, and of technological redemption. The human angle, the men behind the machines, many Corsair. Pilots were young Marines, barely out of training, fighting from jungle airstrips built by Seabees under constant enemy bombardment. They lived in tents, ate canned rations, and flew missions that lasted less than an hour, but felt like lifetimes. To them, the Corsair wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They spoke of it with both fear and affection. Its torque on takeoff could flip the plane if the throttle was opened too quickly. Its long nose made landings nearly blind. But once airborne, it felt like liberation. Each pilot discovered that the plane demanded respect. Those who fought it learned humility. Those who mastered it, glory. And somewhere in the skies between, Bougainville and Rabaul, history pivoted, from the grace of the Zero to the might of the Corsair. The balance of air power had shifted, but not fully yet. Japan still had veteran aces, lethal tactics, and the will to fight. The defining encounters, the ones that would end any debate, were about to unfold. The leadership angle. Commanders who saw the future. The F4U's rise was not only a story of machines, but of men who understood how to use them. One of the earliest advocates was Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, leader of VMF 212, the Black Sheep Squadron. A former flying tiger, Boyington had seen the power of air superiority firsthand. He molded his squadron from a group of replacement pilots, raw, untested, but eager to prove themselves. Boyington saw the Corsair's potential immediately. He taught his men not to fear its quirks, but to harness its strengths: speed, altitude, and firepower. Under his command, they adopted aggressive hit-and-run tactics that turned the Corsair into a fearsome predator. In months, the Black Sheep racked up dozens of aerial victories, becoming a symbol of marine aviation's resurgence. Boyington's leadership was reckless to some, inspiring to others. But it worked. He gave his pilots confidence not just in themselves, but in the machine beneath them. His legacy would forever be tied to the Corsair's legend. A squadron that rose from chaos to dominance, fueled by daring and ingenuity. The enemy's perspective, shock and realization, to the Japanese, the first encounters with Corsairs felt like a shift in the natural order. Their intelligence officers noted new American planes with bent wings and immense engines, reporting that they could outdive and outclimb even the famed A6M50 Sen. Some refused to believe the reports. For years, Japanese engineers had been told their designs were untouchable. But by mid-1943, even aces like Saburo Sakai acknowledged the changing balance. Sakai wrote after encountering newer American fighters that our aircraft could no longer dictate the fight. The Japanese command faced a grim dilemma. They had no immediate replacement ready. The N1K-1 Shiden and Kai-84 Hayate were still in development, plagued by mechanical problems and shortages. The Zero, once their greatest symbol, was becoming a relic of a bygone phase of the war. Pilots described the Corsair's roar as unnatural, a sound that echoed across the sea before it appeared. They nicknamed it the Bent Wing Devil. Fear crept in, a new and dangerous element that had never existed in the early days of the Pacific War. The moral angle, industry versus artistry, the confrontation between the Zero and the Corsair went beyond aerodynamics. It reflected the clash of civilizations at war. Japan's design philosophy was rooted in artistry, the perfection of craftsmanship, the pursuit of the lightest, most elegant form possible. America's approach was rooted in industry, the relentless multiplication of power, steel, and production lines. The Corsair embodied the industrial age of war. Each part was a triumph of manufacturing, precision built in factories from Connecticut to Ohio. Thousands of men and women on assembly lines contributed to each aircraft. Unlike the Zero, handcrafted by specialists, the Corsair was built in numbers the Japanese could never match. That difference defined the outcome. The Zero was a masterpiece. The Corsair was a machine of momentum. The industrial world had learned to turn creativity into scale. This moral shift from artistry to industry became the foundation of modern warfare. And in the Pacific, it was on full display in the contrast between these two fighters. The technological evolution. From the ground up, while the Corsair stunned the Japanese in the sky, its evolution continued on the ground. Every encounter revealed new lessons. Mechanics modified air filters to deal with Pacific dust. Engineers adjusted wing flaps and landing gear to make carrier operations safer. By 1944, the U.S. Navy finally reconsidered its earlier decision and cleared the Corsair for carrier service. This was unprecedented, A fighter once rejected as too dangerous for carriers had evolved into the Navy's premier aircraft. Its foldable wings, rugged landing gear, and immense range made it a cornerstone of the American advance across the Pacific. As production increased, the Corsair evolved through successive versions. The F4U 1A, F4U 1D, and F4U 4, each faster and better armed. It carried rockets, bombs, and machine guns, transforming from pure fighter into multi-role strike aircraft. By the time Japan realized how far America's designs had advanced, it was too late. The skies were no longer theirs. By late 1943, the contrast between the two nations was undeniable. Japan, stretched thin, clinging to an older idea of aerial warfare. America, learning, adapting, and producing without pause. The stage was now set for the climactic confrontations, the moments when the Corsair would not just rival the Zero, but completely replace it as the undisputed ruler of the Pacific skies. It was May 1943, above the Solomon Islands, when the legend of the F4U Corsair finally came of age. At dawn, the air above New Georgia shimmered with heat and the rising hum of engines. Japanese patrols had taken off from Kahili Airfield, their Zeros cutting smooth arcs through the sky. Below them, on a strip of coral and crushed shell, Marine Corsairs of VMF 100 PNI 24 began their takeoff roll. One by one, engines screaming, wings flexing under raw torque. The Corsair pilots had orders to intercept a Japanese raid headed for Munda Point. It would be the first major test of their machine, and of the men flying it. As the blue fighters climbed, the air filled with the deep, rhythmic thunder of the double Wasp engines. The Japanese formation appeared in the distance, nearly 20 Zeros, sunlight flashing on their wings. The Americans had 12 Corsairs, outnumbered, but climbing fast. Major Kenneth Walsh, a pilot who would later become one of the top Corsair aces, led the group. He was calm, deliberate, his hand steady on the throttle. At 17,000 feet, his oxygen mask hissed as he spoke quietly into his mic. "They're coming. High side, let's make it clean." The first pass came fast and brutal. Walsh dove from altitude, his guns spitting fire. The lead Zero exploded in mid-air, its engine shearing away in flames. The Americans didn't turn back. They climbed again, higher, faster, and struck from above once more. This was boom and zoom warfare perfected. The Corsair didn't dance. It dictated. Japanese pilots tried to lure them into turning duels, the kind they had always won before. But the Corsair pilots refused. Every time the Zero banked sharply, the Corsair simply climbed away, looping back in a high-speed dive. The Zero pilots, accustomed to dominance, were suddenly powerless. Their engines strained, their wings trembled under the speeds the Corsairs maintained effortlessly. By the end of the day, 7 Zeros had been shot down. Only one Corsair was lost. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was psychological. Japanese survivors reported seeing new blue aircraft that could not be escaped once they began to dive. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was dying. In the clouds over the Solomons, as the campaign expanded, so did the Corsair's reputation. In August 1943, the Marines struck again over Bougainville and Rabaul, where Japan's air forces still held strong positions. The Corsairs flew in large formations now, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. At Rabaul, one of the most heavily defended bases in the Pacific, they faced dozens of Japanese fighters, including veteran aces. The Japanese expected another easy victory. Instead, they were ambushed from above. Corsairs dove out of the sun, their 6 Brownings tearing through zero formations. Pilots later said they could feel their guns recoil through the whole fuselage. One Marine described the sensation as like throwing lightning. In that single engagement, the Marines claimed over 20 enemy aircraft, not because the Corsair turned tighter or looked prettier, but because it let its pilots choose when to fight and when to live. Reports from Japanese units became increasingly desperate. At Rabaul, one officer noted, their new aircraft can attack, dive, and climb in a single sequence. Our Zeros cannot pursue without structural damage. That structural damage came from the Zero's thin wings and lightweight airframe, perfect for maneuvering, but fragile under extreme stress. The Corsair, meanwhile, was built like a tank. Its wings didn't flutter. They sliced through air like blades. For the first time in the Pacific, the Americans weren't just defending, they were hunting. Each victory was more than a number. Every Corsair kill meant one less experienced Japanese pilot. And those were running out. The Imperial Navy's training system, once its greatest strength, was collapsing under the weight of attrition. By late 1943, Japanese squadrons were filling their ranks with barely trained rookies. Against veterans flying Corsairs, it was slaughter. At the same time, the Corsair's legend grew back home. Newsreels showed its strange bent wings and massive propeller, calling it the Navy's new hammer of the Pacific. Pilots described it in interviews as a plane that looked angry even when parked, but beneath the pride was a sober truth. These victories were bought with blood. Corsair missions were dangerous, flown from primitive strips under constant attack. Mechanics slept beside their planes to keep them ready. Pilots launched daily with the knowledge that many would not return. Still, they flew, and with each mission, the balance of power tilted further toward the United States. By the end of 1943, the Corsair was no longer an experiment. It was a symbol of what American industry could build and what the Marines could endure. The Japanese had entered the war believing they would always control the air. By the time 1944 dawned, that illusion was dissolving. One Corsair sortie at a time. The final proof would come not just in skirmishes or ambushes, but in a massive campaign, one where the Corsair would meet the Zero across vast distances and decide who truly ruled the Pacific. The full measure of the Corsair's power came in 1944, when the U.S. began its relentless march across the Central Pacific, toward Truk Lagoon, the Marianas, and beyond. This was no longer a fight for territory alone. It was a contest for air dominance, and the Corsair was now leading the charge. Rabaul, the Sky Fortress Falls. By early 1944, Rabaul had become a fortress. Hidden among volcanic ridges and deep coves, it was Japan's strongest base outside its home islands. Hundreds of Zeros and bombers stood ready to repel any assault. The Americans decided to destroy it, not by invasion, but from the air. On February 19, 1944, hundreds of Corsairs, Hellcats, and bombers roared toward Rabaul in the largest raid yet seen in the Pacific. Marine Corsairs, flying from island bases like Bougainville, swept ahead as fighter escort. As they approached the coastline, Japanese radar stations crackled warnings. Dozens of Zeros scrambled to intercept. The sky turned into a maze of contrails and gunfire. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington led his men from VMF 212 into the storm. His voice crackled over the radio, calm but sharp. "Stay high. Pick your fight. Don't let them pull you down." The Corsairs dove through the cloud banks, guns blazing. They hit bombers, fighters, even the anti-aircraft positions on the ground. The Zero pilots, trained to climb and turn, tried to counterattack. But their maneuvers failed. The Corsairs struck fast, climbed away, then returned from another angle. Japanese gunners below watched helplessly as their own air cover evaporated. The once feared Rabaul defenses were shredded in a matter of hours. Boyington's men claimed 20 kills that day. Boyington himself shot down 5 before being forced to bail out over enemy waters. Captured, but already a legend. Rabaul never recovered. Its airfields became graveyards of twisted aluminum, a symbol of how the balance of power had shifted forever. The Corsairs' conquest of the Pacific in the months that followed. Corsairs spread across the Pacific like a steel tide. They flew from Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa, each island another stepping stone toward Japan. By now, the F4U had been fully adapted for carrier operations. Naval squadrons joined the fight, their blue wings folded on flight decks, waiting for dawn. When they launched, the roar of dozens of double wasps became the sound of American air superiority. Japanese pilots still fought bravely, but their machines could no longer match the Corsairs' speed or altitude. Even new designs like the A6M8 and N1K1J George struggled to reach parity, hindered by poor materials and inexperienced pilots. In contrast, Corsair pilots were now hardened veterans. Many had survived months of brutal combat. They flew with calm precision, their discipline sharpened by loss. One after another, key Japanese bases fell. At Truk, Corsairs tore through air defenses, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground. At Peleliu and Okinawa, they strafed enemy positions and escorted bombers deep into hostile skies. The Zero, once a symbol of Japanese dominance, was reduced to desperate kamikaze missions, a tragic reflection of how far the Empire's fortunes had fallen. Technical superiority meets human resolve. What made the Corsair unbeatable wasn't just speed or firepower, it was adaptability. It could carry bombs, rockets, and even napalm. It could fight Zeros 1 hour and destroy ground targets the next. Its massive engine gave it range, and its armor gave it survival. Pilots often returned with bullet holes the size of fists through their wings, and yet lived to fly again. Mechanics patched the planes overnight, and they flew again at dawn. This relentless cycle, attack, repair, return, wore down the Japanese war machine. While Japan's factories struggled under Allied bombing, American assembly lines produced hundreds of Corsairs each month. The industrial imbalance had become a weapon all its own. By the end of 1944, the Corsairs' kill-to-loss ratio in the Pacific exceeded 11-1, one of the highest in aviation history. It wasn't luck, it was evolution, the proof that technology, discipline, and endurance could triumph over even the most feared adversary. The last stand of the Zero, the final symbolic encounter between the Zero and the Corsair, came over the Philippines in late 1944. A flight of Japanese aircraft mostly outdated Zeros, scrambled to intercept a U.S. strike force. They never stood a chance. The Corsairs descended in formation, their engines growling like a storm. Within minutes, the Japanese formation disintegrated. Some tried to flee, others turned kamikaze. For the first time since 1941, the American pilots didn't just win, they dominated effortlessly. Afterward, one pilot wrote in his logbook, "We used to fear their planes. Now, we pity them." It was a cruel truth. The war that had begun with Japan's aerial superiority had now turned into a rout. The Corsair had not just met the Zero. It had outlived it, outclassed it, and buried it in the ashes of Rabaul, Truk, and Okinawa. From that moment on, the Pacific belonged to the blue-winged Corsairs. The Zero, once the hunter, had become the hunted, and the age of the samurai in the sky, the elegant, handcrafted duelist, was over. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the numbers told a story few could have imagined 2 years earlier. The once invincible Mitsubishi Zero, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had been dethroned by the machine it had underestimated, the F4U Corsair. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. had achieved near-total air supremacy across the Central Pacific. Carrier task forces, escorted by Corsairs and Hellcats, roamed freely. Japanese convoys moved only by night, and even then under constant fear of strafing attacks. At Truk Lagoon, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground in a single day. At Saipan and Tinian, Corsairs flew round-the-clock support, turning every ridge and bunker into rubble. The Zero, once master of the sky, had become prey. Yet, this transformation was not purely mechanical. It was human. It was the culmination of experience, adaptation, and sacrifice. Men like Kenneth Walsh, Pappy Boyington, and Tom Blackburn had turned the Corsair from an unpredictable beast into a precision weapon. Each sortie, written in their logs, carried not just numbers, but the evolution of American air doctrine, a doctrine built on learning fast and never repeating mistakes. From their forward bases, mechanics and engineers kept the Corsairs alive with extraordinary devotion. Replacement parts often arrived damaged, or not at all, so they improvised, melting scrap aluminum, reworking cylinder heads, stitching fabric over bullet holes. The Corsair was as much a triumph of field innovation as of factory engineering. Meanwhile, the Japanese war effort was crumbling under industrial strain. The loss of seasoned pilots could not be replaced. By late 1944, the average Japanese airman had fewer than 150 hours of flight experience, compared to over 500 for American pilots. Fuel shortages limited training even further. The Corsair's dominance grew not because Japan stopped fighting, but because America never stopped building. At sea, the U.S. Navy finally integrated Corsair squadrons into carrier groups. Their curved wings folded neatly beside Hellcats on the decks of Essex-class carriers, waiting for the signal to launch. When those blue shapes lifted off the deck, it meant one thing to Japanese spotters. An attack was coming, and it would not be turned back. By the end of 1944, Corsairs flew combat missions across the Pacific, from the Marshalls to Okinawa. Their roles expanded: interception, bombing, naval strike, even night fighting. They had become the Swiss Army knife of American air power. And while victory drew nearer, the human cost weighed heavily. Many Corsair pilots never returned. Even as they outflew and outgunned the Zero, they faced deadly flak, treacherous weather, and fatigue that could kill as surely as bullets. Those who survived carried memories of streaking tracer fire, of seeing a zero flash past their canopy, of hearing their own engines stutter with damage. The Corsair had saved their lives, but it had demanded everything in return. Still, for every plane lost, another took off. The Pacific War had turned into an assembly line of attrition, and the side that could sustain it would win. By the time the Corsair arrived over Okinawa in early 1945, it was no longer a new fighter. It was a symbol, a sound that echoed across the sea before bombs ever fell. The Japanese had entered the war with the most advanced fighter on Earth. They would end it facing one that had surpassed it in every possible measure: speed, strength, and survivability. The tides of the Pacific War had reversed completely, and the Corsair, once doubted and delayed, had become the spearhead of victory. The final year of the Pacific War unfolded beneath skies the Corsair now ruled. From island to island, from the Philippines to Iwo Jima, the roar of the Pratt Whitney R-2800 had become the soundtrack of Allied advance. Every Japanese airfield within reach was burned, every convoy at sea hunted down. Corsairs no longer fought for survival. They fought to finish the war. By early 1945, they had evolved into true multi-role machines. They carried rockets for bunker busting, bombs for ship strikes, and machine guns for sweeping through ground positions. At Okinawa, they flew more than 64,000 combat sorties, the highest number for any fighter type in the Pacific Campaign. From dawn until dusk, they circled above the beaches, providing cover to Marines under constant kamikaze attack. It was here that the Corsair met its final challenge. Not the Zero, but the desperation of the Empire itself. Kamikaze pilots, flying outdated aircraft packed with explosives, hurled themselves at American ships. The Corsairs rose to meet them head-on, intercepting waves of suicide planes before they reached the fleet. It was brutal work, fast, merciless, and deeply personal. Pilots often saw faces in the cockpits before firing. The Corsair's power saved countless lives in those final months. Its speed allowed intercepts that would have been impossible for slower planes. Its durability meant it could absorb hits and still land. Many pilots brought home aircraft shredded by shrapnel, the engines still rumbling. After Okinawa, the end was inevitable. Japan's industrial centers lay in ruins. Its fuel reserves were gone. The skies, once filled with Zeros, now belonged entirely to America's flying steel. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Corsair squadrons remained on standby, ready for the invasion that never came. They had helped clear the path for it. But the war ended before they had to fly that last mission. A legacy written in blue. When peace returned, the Corsair's story didn't end. It remained in service well into the 1950s, flying in Korea, France, and even South America. The same design that had once terrified Zero pilots proved so advanced it outlived many of its successors. In total, over 12,500 Corsairs were built across multiple variants, one of the longest production runs in fighter history. Its kill ratio in World War II was estimated at 11-1, a number almost unmatched in any theater of war. But numbers tell only part of its legacy. The Corsair became a symbol of transformation, a machine born from chaos, forged in doubt, and refined through relentless perseverance. Its pilots weren't movie heroes or polished veterans. They were Marines and sailors who learned to master an aircraft that punished mistakes and rewarded courage. For the Japanese, the Corsair represented something deeper. The end of an age. The Zero had embodied precision and purity of purpose. The Corsair embodied scale, adaptation, and the unrelenting rhythm of modern war. One was built by craftsmen, the other by a nation mobilized for total victory. As post-war Japan rebuilt, engineers and historians studied the Corsair's design. The bent wings, the engine layout, the aerodynamic compromise that became perfection. They saw in it not arrogance, but evolution, a design that changed the very concept of naval aviation. When the last Zero was grounded and the last Corsair wheeled into a museum, both stood as monuments to their nations, one to the courage of its pilots, the other to the industrial might that reshaped history. By the time the Pacific fell silent, the blue-winged Corsair had done more than win air battles. It had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, proving that the outcome of modern conflict would belong to those who could innovate and endure. And in the quiet years that followed, when veterans spoke of the war, they often remembered not the sound of explosions, but the deep, rising growl of that great radial engine, the sound that had carried them through the storm and into history. The story of the F4U Corsair is not only a chapter in military engineering, it is the story of how nations evolve under fire. When it first took to the air, the Corsair was seen as flawed, too heavy, too temperamental, too unpredictable. Yet within 2 years, it became the embodiment of American resilience, proof that the chaos of invention could forge instruments of precision and power. It represented the moment when modern warfare left the realm of duels and dogfights and entered the era of industrial momentum. Every rivet, every panel, every turn of that double Wasp engine was the echo of factories, assembly lines, and workers who would never see the front. It was victory through collaboration, a million hands building a single idea. For Japan, the Corsair's rise marked the twilight of a different age, one where artistry and discipline could no longer overcome machinery and mass. The Zero had ruled through purity of design. The Corsair won through adaptability. That was the future of war. Yet beneath the steel and smoke, this was always a human story. Young men faced each other above the Pacific, one believing in the grace of his aircraft, the other trusting in the strength of his. Both fought with conviction, both believing they flew for something eternal. When the war ended, the skies grew quiet again. But the Corsair's silhouette remained etched against history, a reminder that innovation is not born in comfort, but in necessity. It ruled the Pacific not merely because it was faster or stronger, but because it represented the relentless drive to learn, adapt, and endure, the traits that shape every victory and define every era. In the calm that followed the fire, the Corsair stood as a silent witness to humanity's paradox, the power to destroy and the equal power to create. And as the sun set over the Pacific once more, the sound of that great bent-wing fighter faded, leaving behind not thunder, but memory.